They called it honor. History called it civilization. But behind every banner raised in victory there were screams. History refused to echo, women stolen, broken and erased. Their names traded like spoils, their bodies turned into symbols of power. From the roaring crowds of Rome's arenas to the burning monasteries raided by Vikings, the story of conquest was never just about glory. It was about ownership, and for centuries empires built their pride on a secret too cruel to speak. So, here's the question. History never answered. When the victors wrote their legends, who buried the truth of the women they destroyed? The crowd roared like thunder inside the Colosseum. Beneath the marble arches, the empire performed its favourite illusion, that violence could be noble, that death could be entertainment. Gladiators clashed under the sun's white fire, their sweat and blood mingling with the sand. But hidden behind the spectacle were those who never fought, the women who made this cruelty possible. Many were captives, dragged from conquered lands, Gaul, Britannia, Germania, and beyond. Rome called them spoils, not people. Stripped of family and name, they were forced into the empire's pleasure houses or paraded through the streets as living trophies. During triumphs, generals rode in gold chariots, while bound women followed behind them, half naked, their humiliation feeding the crowd's hunger for power. The games were never just about combat, they were propaganda. Each lash, each scream was a declaration that Rome ruled the world. In the stands sat senators, priests, and noble women, cheering not just for blood, but for domination itself. The message was clear. In Rome, even life belonged to the empire, and yet history rarely mentions them. The captives who never entered the arena but whose bodies bore the empire's unrecorded wars. Away from the public gaze, another theatre existed, darker, quieter, and far more cruel. Captive women, especially those of noble birth, were used to entertain Rome's elite long after the games ended. Some were given as gifts to victorious gladiators for morale. Others were locked in private chambers beneath the amphitheatre, where powerful men could indulge their fantasies of conquest without consequence. Roman writers celebrated their empire's moral superiority. Virtues, honour, civilitas. But their own poets whispered a different truth. Ovid wrote of women enslaved by lust and violence. Juvenal mocked the wives of senators who kept gladiators as lovers, drawn to the scent of blood, and yet even these accounts are fragments, glimpses through the cracks of censorship and shame. The empire's silence was deliberate. To admit the scale of sexual slavery within its borders would have meant exposing the rot beneath its marble, so the records focused on heroes and battles, not the captives beneath them. The stories of women were reduced to whispers in the margins. Unfortunate, taken, lost. In Rome's mythology, the city was the mother of civilization. In truth, she was built on the backs of mothers who never got to raise their children. Centuries later, historians would look back on Rome as the cradle of law, order, and reason. But beneath that legacy lies a contradiction too vast to ignore. The same empire that built aqueducts and libraries also perfected the system of human ownership. It turned flesh into currency and called it progress. In the Roman mind, power justified everything. Conquered men were slaves, conquered women were rewards. The cruelty was not a flaw, it was policy. The amphitheatre, the brothel, and the household all served the same purpose to remind the conquered that resistance was futile. Yet every empire needs its illusion, the idea that domination is destiny. So Rome told itself it was civilizing the world. Statues were raised, laws were written, and the screams of the enslaved were buried under marble. The myth endured because silence was convenient, but when archaeologists dig beneath the Colosseum today, they still find traces. Bones of young women mixed with those of beasts, jewellery buried in slave quarters, and iron shackles shaped for wrists too small to fight. The empire called them spoils, History called them forgotten, but their silence still speaks, louder than the cheers that once filled the Colosseum. The first blow came before dawn. Bells meant for prayer became alarms, echoing across the cold shores of Lindisfarne in 793 AD. The monks thought it was a storm until the longships appeared, slicing through the fog like blades. The raiders came with axes, torches, and laughter that froze the blood. They weren't soldiers of a kingdom, they were merchants of terror. Within hours the monastery burned, altars were overturned, relics smashed, and the sacred books, those lifelines to faith, were drowned in blood and seawater. What happened to the monks was written down. What happened to the women was not. Among the victims were nuns, widows, and lay sisters who lived in adjoining convents. Chronicles mention them only in fragments. They were carried off by the pagans, one scribe wrote, his ink trembling. But those 4 words conceal what truly unfolded: humiliation, enslavement, and silence that would last generations. The Vikings didn't raid for religion, they raided for wealth, and in early medieval Europe, human beings were the most profitable currency. The holy women of the church, sworn to chastity, became the most blasphemous prizes of all. Their capture wasn't just theft, it was desecration. Official chronicles told the story in euphemisms: taken captive, violated, sent overseas. Behind those sanitized words was an organized system of trade that stretched across the North Sea. Captured women were transported to markets in Dublin, York, and Hedeby, cities that grew rich not from conquest alone, but from human flesh. Norse sagas rarely mention the nuns directly, but archaeology fills in what the poets refused to say. At Repton, a burial mound revealed the bones of women with shackled ankles and deliberate fractures, signs of restraint and abuse. At Hedeby, combs and rosaries of Anglo-Saxon design were found in slave quarters, silent witnesses to lives that once belonged to prayer. To the Norse, slavery wasn't shameful, it was an accepted structure of power. Their laws classified captives as thralls, property to be bought, sold, or bred. Even children born to enslaved women were automatically enslaved, their fate sealed before their first breath. Some Christian records tried to reinterpret the suffering as divine punishment, God's wrath for human sin. But this too was a form of erasure, a way to explain horror without confronting it. To call these women martyrs would have been to admit the Church's failure to protect them, and so most names vanished. By the 9th century, Viking raids had evolved into a network of human trafficking that linked Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland, and even the Abbasid Caliphate ships left the north loaded not only with silver and silk, but with the bound bodies of women and children. Those taken from holy sites were often the most valuable, educated, unscarred, and symbolic of spiritual victory. In the bustling markets of Dublin and Birka, Christian captives were auctioned alongside amber and furs. Some were sold into noble households as concubines, others disappeared into distant lands, renamed, repurposed, and rewritten. The Norse sagas glorified exploration, but behind every voyage was a chain of human suffering. And yet, medieval chroniclers softened the truth. They described the raids as acts of pagan ferocity, wild, barbaric, godless rage. That framing served both sides. It demonized the Northmen while hiding the reality that Christian kingdoms would soon adopt the same system themselves. The monasteries burned, but the trade survived, refined, legalized, baptized in the language of faith. The Vikings did not invent cruelty. They only revealed how easily civilization could copy it, because when the flames of Lindisfarne died, the silence that followed was not peace, it was profit. By the 9th century, Viking raids had evolved into a network of human trafficking that linked Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland, and even the Abbasid Caliphate ships left the north loaded not only with silver and silk, but with the bound bodies of women and children. Those taken from holy sites were often the most valuable, educated, unscarred, and symbolic of spiritual victory. In the bustling markets of Dublin and Birka, Christian captives were auctioned alongside amber and furs. Some were sold into noble households as concubines, others disappeared into distant lands, renamed, repurposed, and rewritten. The Norse sagas glorified exploration, but behind every voyage was a chain of human suffering. And yet, medieval chroniclers softened the truth. They described the raids as acts of pagan ferocity, wild, barbaric, godless rage. That framing served both sides. It demonized the Northmen while hiding the reality that Christian kingdoms would soon adopt the same system themselves. The monasteries burned, but the trade survived, refined, legalized, baptized in the language of faith. The Vikings did not invent cruelty. They only revealed how easily civilization could copy it, because when the flames of Lindisfarne died, the silence that followed was not peace, it was profit. The Norse saw the body as an asset, not sacred, not inviolable, but usable. A woman's fertility could be legislated just like a farmer's field or a shipwright's timber. In one section of the Eyrbyggja saga, a freedman's daughter is re-enslaved through marriage to a man who owned her womb under his household rights. The logic was brutal and simple. What a woman bore belonged to her master. Children of enslaved women, called ambatir, became the invisible workforce of the North. Their existence kept farms running and trade alive. They carried water, spun cloth, nursed their own as infants, and when they grew older, were traded like livestock. Legal texts from Sweden and Norway show clauses allowing owners to breed thralls intentionally to increase their value. Violence in this world was not outlawed, it was legalized. If a thrall woman escaped, her master could kill her publicly as a warning to others. If she stole food, her hands could be branded or cut. Yet the same societies wrote sagas filled with poetry and valour. Songs of warriors who claimed to honour the gods. Odin demanded sacrifice. The law demanded obedience. Archaeologists have found iron collars inscribed with runes, not of prayer, but of ownership, property of Eirik. Belongs to Torsten. These were not metaphors, they were legal signatures, carved in iron and sealed in flesh. What began in Norse lands did not stay there. The trade routes that carried amber and fur also carried laws, ideas about hierarchy, property, and power. When Viking settlers integrated into Christian kingdoms, they brought their systems of control with them. The language changed, but the principle did not. Women as property, reproduction as commerce, violence as order. By the 11th century, in parts of England and Normandy, laws bore traces of Norse structure. Terms like waif, bondmaid, and nativus appeared, all legal descendants of the thrall system. Even when Christianity spread, baptism could not wash away the institution of ownership. The Church condemned paganism, but quietly absorbed its hierarchies. In royal courts, noblemen now claimed divine right over those below them. Marriage contracts spoke of guardianship, dowries, and rights of the husband. These were polite echoes of the same logic that once chained thralls in the north. What had been brutality became bureaucracy. The Norse didn't just shape Europe's trade, they shaped its morality. They proved that cruelty could coexist with culture, that law could sanctify suffering. And centuries later, when kings and conquerors enslaved in the name of God instead of Odin, they followed the same ancient script, ownership disguised as civilization. Because once the law decides a body can be owned, it never truly learns to see a body as human again. Beneath the cobblestones of York, the green fields of Dublin, the windswept mounds of Repton, and the bustling port of Hedeby, archaeologists have uncovered secrets that history tried desperately to bury mass graves. Some hidden for over a millennium reveal a reality the chronicles refuse to record. The systematic captivity, abuse, and death of women taken in raids. In Dublin, a site near the old Viking long fort revealed skeletons of young women, carefully positioned yet bearing unmistakable signs of trauma, fractured ribs, healed and unhealed knife cuts, and shackling marks around their wrists and ankles. DNA analysis showed links to distant regions, Scandinavia, Anglo-Saxon England, and even the Irish Midlands, confirming the extensive movement of women across the trade networks established by Viking conquerors. These were not casualties of battle. They were prizes, moved, exploited, and often killed for reasons lost to history. Repton, famous as a Viking burial site for warriors, also yielded female skeletons among the mounds. Archaeologists noticed something chilling. The placement of these women suggested ritualistic violence. Some were buried with personal items, combs, necklaces, remnants of rosaries, not as objects of honour, but as silent markers of ownership. The dead were catalogued, labelled, and forgotten. Beyond bones, objects speak with eerie clarity. At Edeby, finely crafted jewellery, religious artefacts and domestic tools were found alongside shackles, ropes, and remnants of cages. Some items were deliberately broken or inscribed with Norse runes denoting the owner, a reminder that even in death, these women were regarded as property. Genetic analysis adds another layer of understanding. Traces of trauma preserved in teeth and bone tissue reveal chronic malnutrition and repeated physical abuse. Studies of isotopes in teeth show that many women had been moved across vast distances in their short lives, adapting to new diets and climates, often under duress. Archaeology does not lie. It exposes a truth more precise than any written record. Even burial patterns tell a story. Women were rarely interred in communal sacred grounds alongside free citizens. Their graves were peripheral, often overlooked, deliberately marginal. In York, one cemetery held a cluster of women with traces of Christian burial rites, crossed hands, small amulets, but the graves were outside consecrated ground. The church's attempt to sanctify their deaths could not erase the injustice of their lives. Science has become the voice for those history silenced. Modern forensic archaeology allows researchers to reconstruct the final days of these women, their injuries, their journeys, even hints of the trauma inflicted upon them. CT scans of skeletal remains reveal healed fractures that suggest repeated abuse. Hair and soil samples point to forced labour and long marches. Patterns emerge across sites. Captivity was rarely brief. Women endured months, sometimes years, of bondage before being sold, traded, or killed. Some were used as concubines, others as domestic labourers, and some disappeared entirely, leaving only traces in the soil and DNA for modern science to uncover. Yet despite this evidence, written records remain astonishingly silent. Chronicles of Viking raids celebrate plunder, wealth, and valour, but women rarely appear by name. They are footnotes, taken captive, lost, or simply omitted. Archaeology bridges this gap, giving voice to what history refused to record. The stones, soil, and bones speak louder than any scribe ever dared. The silence imposed by empire, faith, and culture was meant to erase them. But beneath the earth, the truth endures. In the fractured bones of Dublin, the arranged skeletons of Repton, and the artefacts of Hedeby, the lives of these women whisper across the centuries. They existed, they suffered, and their stories, finally, demand to be heard. The fall of Viking power did not end the systems of exploitation they had perfected. It only gave them a new justification. As Christian kingdoms expanded across Europe, the Church did not abolish slavery. It sanctified it. Captured peoples, particularly women, were now framed as instruments of divine will. Violence, previously rationalized through conquest or profit, became holy, righteous, and blessed by God. In medieval chronicles, kings and knights carried banners of the cross into lands previously raided by pagans. The rhetoric promised salvation for those who fought, but the women they captured often endured the same fates as the thralls of the North nobility, rationalized enslavement as a tool of conversion. Forced labor, sexual servitude, and concubinage were reframed as a method of civilizing the heathen and bringing them into Christ's fold. Legal codes began to reflect this merger of faith and control. Dowries, guardianships, and servile obligations became instruments of power. A nobleman's claim over a woman's body could now be couched in spiritual terms: obedience to the church, submission to God, and protection of her soul, all while her life and freedom remained entirely in his hands. Captured women were recast as both symbols and instruments of faith. In convents, monasteries, and royal courts, women were employed to display the piety of their owners. Some were forced into religious servitude, ostensibly to protect their souls, while others were consigned to domestic or sexual slavery under the guise of Christian order. Their bodies became tools of political and spiritual control, demonstrating the ruler's divine mandate to govern, punish, and claim ownership. Sanctified violence was not limited to isolated incidents. Wars, crusades, and campaigns of expansion incorporated the capture and redistribution of women as routine practice. Chroniclers praised victories in terms of land and treasure, but rarely mentioned the human cost. The women taken as prizes, their fates rewritten as acts of divine justice. Even marriages were politicized. Noble women, often forcibly wed to conquerors or powerful allies, were celebrated as symbols of unity and faith. While common women were reduced to property, their labour and fertility claimed for spiritual and temporal gain alike. The intersection of religion and patriarchy ensured that cruelty could masquerade as righteousness. This system created a dangerous precedent. Cruelty in the name of God became law. The church legitimized structures of domination, while rulers codified them into the legal frameworks of kingdoms. In England, France, and Iberia, laws mirrored the Norse models: inheritance of bondage, property rights over women, and sanctioned punishment for those who resisted. Only now these practices were cloaked in spiritual authority. Monarchs, knights, and clergy alike rationalized their control as pious duty conquered lands, captured women, and enslaved populations were all tools to fulfill divine will. The merging of piety with patriarchy masked brutality as providence. Those who questioned it risked being labelled heretics, rebels, or threats to God's plan. Thus, the systems of the Viking North found new life under the cross. Slavery, sexual exploitation, and violence were no longer merely tolerated. They were celebrated, refined, and recorded in legal and ecclesiastical texts. History would later portray the medieval church as a guardian of morality and civilization. Yet beneath the sermons and cathedrals, a harsh reality persisted. Power and faith had allied to normalize suffering. The women captured during holy wars were not merely victims of conquest. They were instruments of empire, teaching future generations that submission could be sanctified and cruelty could wear the mask of God.